So here at the Presidio, we're blessed with a very long range of history. And it goes very deep, and unfortunately the deepest parts are kind of the most invisible. According to the Ohlone people, the native people of the area, their ancestors had been here since time immemorial. Too long for anyone to remember, countless generations. And when they lived here, there was a small village out on the bay shore called Petlanuk. And it was where a group of about 126 people lived. And at that time, a small number of people in a very kind of close-knit village lived there on the shoreline. There was a marshy shore, abundant plants and animals. At that time, grizzly bears were still walking along the shores. Salmon were still running into the bay. You would find seals plentiful along the bay shore. Copious amounts of waterfowl, a lot of deer grazing, mountain lions, bobcats, things you wouldn't normally see but are still around. A colonial expedition came from the western shores of what is today Mexico all the way up through California and eventually established what they called El Presidio de San Francisco here. Presidio is kind of a mix between a fort and a village. The people that came up here were colonists, but with their families. They were soldiers. So they created a fort here. It became a village and expanded over time. Missions came around that, about 6 missions between Santa Cruz to the south and up towards Santa Rosa area towards the north. The next wave of really change came not with new people, but with new thoughts. There was a long war of independence with Mexico, within Mexico, I should say, where the people were defying the Spanish crown at a time when the Spanish were busy fighting off Napoleon in Europe. So they were preoccupied and their entire American empire fell. And in this part of the world, the country of Mexico gained its independence, and this California became part of Mexico, and the Presidio became one of its fortifications defending this land. So that was in 1821, and about 20 years goes by, and there starts to be some growing sentiment about this new United States of America, and more forays from the East, from English-speaking people coming into California. And a rising population. And in that comes a new colonial expedition, you could think of it as. Instead of colonists from Mexico that were Spanish-speaking, who were soldiers, you have colonists who were soldiers from New York, sailing around the southern tip of South America and landing in San Francisco and taking California by force. There was not a lot of major battles, but it was warfare that brought us California into the United States. From that point forward, a lot of those New York volunteers that were soldiers occupied the Presidio. They went on to become very famous people throughout California. Many of the streets in San Francisco are named after those New York volunteers. And we wind up with the Presidio as a kind of a frontier outpost, taking on many of the same duties, protecting the harbor, which soon was going to be a site where gold was flowing out from the Sierra Mountains out the Golden Gate, and fortifying the banks of the United States. And this little small fortification started to kind of expand over time. It got a little bit bigger. It got less of a fort and more of a post. There was no walls around it because there was no threat to the Presidio. And if you came here, it'd still be a windswept kind of peninsula overlooking the water. But it started to kind of look a little bit more like a loose collection of buildings. Soon the U.S. really started to expand its ambitions, and those ambitions began to expand across the Pacific. Was the first really big move, and the Presidio greatly expanded. At that time, in the late 1890s, there was going to be a war with Spain that would occupy the United States forces in both the Philippines and Cuba. All the troops that went to the Philippines came through the Presidio. This place was bustling. thousands and thousands of soldiers from all different states, militiaed and marshaled out from different states. So a group from Iowa would come through, get trained in the Presidio, and ship off to the Philippines. A group from Kansas would come through, get trained in the Presidio, and get shipped off to the Philippines. State after state, volunteer militias after volunteer militias. And the post kind of kept growing. And then they started adding hospitals and more barracks and things to care for the soldiers, to train the soldiers before they went out, and then to care for the injured soldiers on their way back. This became one of the biggest hospital sites for all the wars of the Pacific, and the post continued to grow. Eventually, that windswept dunes, people wanted to replace that with something that had more of an eastern feel. So they intentionally planted forests. Out here it was of eucalyptus and cypress and Monterey pines, massive forests that are today fully mature. They changed the nature of the buildings and fashions changed over time. A lot of the buildings like this that used to be real, authentic adobe buildings from the Spanish period, they covered in wood and added new wood buildings around it. This one closed in 1994 and was immediately transferred to the National Park Service. And from that day on, we've been slowly working on a project to convert this premier Army post into one of the premier national park sites where people can visit today and see beaches and forests and historic buildings and a whole array of wonderful opportunities.